way late, so we'll get started straight away. My name is James Fox-Higgins. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of The Rational Rise, and I'm very glad to introduce our speakers for this little panel, which is something of a minor debate, although the title of it says that it's the definitive same-sex marriage debate. So if you haven't made up your mind, Australia, now's the time. So our first speaker is Rod McGarvie. Rod's been a carpenter, a combat engineer in the Australian Army, and the director of a language and literacy organisation in Uganda and Tanzania. In 2016, Rod stood as the lead Senate candidate for the Family First Queensland before assuming the role of Queensland State Director of the Australian Conservatives. And he's going to come up here and offer his case. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon and thank you. One of my favourite quotes is from G.K. Chesterton, and it's, "Don't ever take down a fence before you know why it was put up in the first place." And it's important that whenever you're looking at change to keep that in mind, but even more so as we look at this issue here. Those of us that are standing up for the no case are often categorised as bigots and homophobes and haters. Yet, all we are doing is standing up for status quo. The status quo, which is a social good. Status quo, which has been the consistent sense of things since the beginning of written history. So, we are standing up for the status quo. If you want to change the status quo, you should have a very compelling argument for that change, an argument that's going to bring about some sort of greater good to society, something that's going to be better, not worse, something that's going to strengthen society, not weaken it. I think as we look at this question, we need to ask ourselves a number of questions before we pull down the important social fence of marriage. What does the foundational document, the Constitution, say about marriage? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't say much. It only covers it. Marriage is only mentioned 3 times in the Constitution, in section 51. And it just, the Commonwealth has responsibilities, respect to such things as marriage and divorce. It's about all it covers. Why didn't it give a definition of marriage? Well, you look back at that time, there was no need for a definition of marriage, but because it was a universal, understood what marriage was. But if we look at some of our founding fathers, a couple of our founding fathers, Sir John Quick and Robert Garran, in their 1901 book, The Annotated Constitution of the Australian Commonwealth, they do define marriage, and they define marriage as a union between one man and one woman, to the exclusion of all others. Why did Prime Minister John Howard seek to clarify the definition of marriage back in 2004? A definition that went through both houses without opposition just 13 years ago. Why did he do that? Well, because he realised that a universally understood concept was no longer universal, that marriage, the definition of marriage, was starting to be challenged. So he saw that assault coming, so he wanted to try and to shore up the definition of traditional marriage. Is there some inherent human rights being denied to the same-sex community through this whole area of marriage? Anything that's being held back from them? Both the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the European Court for Human Rights have held that there is no inequality where the state retains the traditional definition of marriage. No inequality. Are same-sex couples somehow discriminated under Australian law? No. Again, no. 80 pieces of legislation has been changed to remove all discrimination between same-sex couples and married couples. Can we learn anything from the unintended consequences of countries that have already brought same-sex marriage into being? We can learn a lot from those countries. I just cover a few things here. A Canadian father, Stephen Chilokas, lost the right to remove his child from radical sex education programs. In the United States, Atlanta Fire Chief Kelvin Cochran and Mozilla CEO Brendan Each have lost their jobs because of their beliefs in marriage. In the UK, a private Jewish girls' school, primary level, looks like being shut down because they won't promote LBGT agenda. In Ireland, just 6 months after same-sex marriage was brought into being there, there was already a legislative push to undermine religious protections. In Northern Ireland, Daniel and Amy MacArthur of Ash's Bakery were fined for declining to decorate a cake with a pro-same-sex marriage political slogan. What about here in Australia? Is there any early indicators even before we make any changes? There are a number. Bishop Porteous hauled before the Tasmanian Commission for Human Rights just for doing his job, just with communicating with families, Catholic families within his parish. Dr. Patsy Lai had a Get Up campaign set up to try and have her medical licence revoked. Pastor Heidi McGarvie was threatened with violence and threatened to have a church burned down. Same-sex activists have been calling for the crucifixion of Christians and the burning down of churches. So with so many known negative consequences, how is the government, how are they looking at protecting our freedoms? Well, the silence is deafening there. Silence is deafening. They'll only look at the protections once the survey is completed and once there's the push for the yes, if the yes gets through, they'll only look at it then. Yet there's all this weight of negative consequences there. So what's really going on? A number of people are saying that the same-sex marriage push is really just a Trojan horse. It's there, it's coming there for other reasons. Other reasons like getting gender-fluid ideology throughout society, pushing safe schools programs through all schools to all ages, breaking down the family unit, minimise the role of parents in educating their children. Any evidence for the Trojan horse approach? Yep, there is. Lesbian activist Marsha Geshen, this is a quote from her: fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we're going to do with marriage once we get there. Because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist. So this is a lesbian activist. Ros Ward, the architect of the Safe Schools program, declared Marxist. Safe Schools Coalition is about supporting gender and sexual diversity, not about celebrating diversity, not about stopping bullying. So it appears to be simply the old Marxist ideology, but this time it's dressed up in drag. With Marxist ideology, you must destroy the most stable and enduring form of government, the traditional family unit. You have to remove the complementarity of men and women, the unique differences, and create a sameness. You have to break the hold and influence of parents so the state has greater control over what they think and believe. Once we take down the fence, the Trojan horse gets into the city, all sorts of social harms will follow. The no camp are the ones that are trying to keep the gates shut, trying to protect the city from the invaders. The official No campaign says it's okay to vote no. I would say if you're a lover of freedom, then it's imperative to say no. Thank you.
All right, presenting the opposition to those arguments, we have Gabe Buckley next. Gabe has been the national president of the Liberal Democrats political party since 2014 and a member of the federal executive since 2010. He's a veteran of numerous election campaigns, coming within a hair's breadth of securing a Senate seat in 2016. A father of three, Gabe spends his spare time rocking out with his band, the Whiskey Protocol, who I believe will be playing for you guys at LibertyFest. So, yeah, all right, give it up for Gabe.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to Team Yes. Just firstly, to appease any animal rights activists that might be out there, I can assure you that no monkeys were sponked or otherwise inconvenienced in order to create this speech. I'm not going to take credit for this one, but it did make me giggle. What do you call a libertarian against same-sex marriage? A conservative. As I said, it made me giggle, but it also made me think. And I think I've been doing my conservative friends a bit of a disservice by buying into this idea that no is the default position for conservatives on same-sex marriage. And what I'm hoping to do today is to put forward a case, a premise for the yes case from both the libertarian and the conservative positions, because while there are definite and marked differences between the libertarian and the conservative position, it's very simplistic and naive to simply divide us up into libertarians yes, conservatives no. Firstly, what we need to remind ourselves of is what we are actually being asked, and more importantly, what we are not being asked. We're not being asked to approve of homosexuality, we're not being asked to endorse the Safe Schools program, or we're certainly not being asked to, which bathrooms transgendered people can pee in. We're not being asked to vote on legislation, we're not being asked to change the Constitution, we're not being asked to redefine any words or make changes to the millions of heterosexual marriages that are already in existence. What we are being asked is a very simple question of principle, and that question is, should the law be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry? And what I hope to demonstrate today is that for libertarians and conservatives, even deeply religious conservatives, the obvious answer to that question is actually yes. Changing the law to recognise the marriages of same-sex couples has no impact other than to allow the government to recognise the marriages of same-sex couples in the same way that the marriages of heterosexual couples are recognised. Now, whether or not the government recognises our marriages has precisely zero bearing on the cultural and religious significance of that marriage. If the government stopped recognising all marriages, which could quite conceivably be the ideal solution, it would not devalue the commitments that we have made to our partners in front of our gods and our peers. It would not render the Catholic sacrament of holy matrimony any less holy or any less matrimonial. Marriage is not a finite resource. We don't get more married by stopping other people from getting married, and likewise our marriages aren't diluted by allowing other people to get married. It simply allows them to share in the same rights that we take for granted. The vast majority of arguments coming from the no camp, I feel, amount to nothing more than simple sophistry. Somewhat hasty justifications for a visceral rather than a cerebral opinion. Now, one thing that both libertarians and conservatives tend to pride themselves on is that we prefer to err on the side of reason and evidence, leaving the feelings to the left. And I think perhaps the most odious argument coming from the no side is that it's okay to vote no because some people on the yes side have behaved poorly. Now, leaving aside the fact that there are plenty of examples of no campaigners who haven't exactly covered themselves in glory, are we really that petty? Are we that puerile and small-minded as to wish to punish thousands of mild-mannered same-sex couples that simply want the right to choose whether or not they get married because of the misbehaviour of a few screeching socialists? Now, screeching lefties have been around for a long time. They were around well before we even started to think about debating same-sex marriage, and voting no on same-sex marriage won't make them go away. We can't defeat unreasonable people by being unreasonable ourselves. It's like the old joke about arguing with idiots. They drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. Our continued occupation of the moral high ground predicated on us answering poor behaviour with dispassionate reason. When a toddler has a tantrum, we don't respond by throwing a bigger one. The religious freedom angle is another area where I don't think the opposition has been particularly well thought out. There's been absolutely no indication that the legal recognition of same-sex marriage would impose any obligation on religious celebrants to conduct same-sex marriages contrary to their opinions, to their religious beliefs. And the notion that bakers and florists and those sort of people would also be affected is also spurious for a number of reasons. Firstly, it conflates wedding receptions with the legal recognition of the marriage that follows. Gay weddings are already perfectly legal, quite fabulous, perfectly legal. They happen all around the country every week. Florists and bakers and the like are already prohibited from discriminating against people based on gender, sexuality or marital status. So absolutely nothing will change there. It will still be the same, admittedly bad situation, but nothing's going to change. They're not going to be more impacted. So should we allow the government to expand the coverage of the Marriage Act to include same-sex marriages? It's not going to affect service providers. And regardless, baking cakes and arranging flowers are not expressions of your religion. This isn't a religious freedom issue. It's a simple freedom of association issue that has a scope far wider than same-sex marriage. However, it is a fairly long-held and highly esteemed constraint on freedom of religion that my right to freely practice my religion ends precisely where your right to not be forced to practice my religion begins. Freedom of religion is inherently inclusive of the right to be free from religion. And currently there are thousands of non-religious civil celebrants around Australia. In fact, civil celebrants perform 3/4 of all marriage ceremonies in Australia today. The freedom of religion of civil celebrants is every bit as important as the freedom of religion of religious celebrants. Currently, civil celebrants are forbidden from solemnising the marriages of same-sex couples on the basis of a religious objection to same-sex marriage. Not only is this a gross restraint of trade, it's precisely the same situation that no campaigners are concerned might arise if we allow same-sex marriage. When we start asking the government to impose our religious values on other people, we then have absolutely no recourse when the government wants to start interfering in our religious observations. And I simply cannot fathom why such an inconsequential thing as allowing same-sex couples to marry is the hill upon which people are prepared to see their religious freedoms die. Our religious freedoms are far too important to give up over something as entirely inconsequential as the government giving us an elephant stamp on our relationship status. Rod mentioned the family unit, and I wholeheartedly agree. The family unit is the foundational basis of society, especially from the conservative perspective, but libertarians, even with our rather grumpy fixation on the individual, we still tend to agree that the family unit, being as it is an entirely voluntary organisation, has a significant amount of merit. It actually disturbs me quite greatly to hear conservatives claiming that marriage is just some sort of licence to procreate. Procreation and marriage are only tangentially related. Same-sex couples are already raising children, they have done for decades. Many of those children of same-sex couples are now happily married themselves. Having our marriages publicly recorded and recognised is simply the highest degree of commitment to binding our family units together. It's getting up and saying, we are one of those foundational elements of society and we're going to do everything within our power to stay that way. Denying same-sex couples the right to solemnise their relationships in the same way is distinctly anti-conservative because it belittles the value of the family union as the bedrock of civil society. Not only that, it plays straight into the hands of those leftists who would rather the children be raised by the state than their parents. So I guess to sum all that up, voting yes on the question of whether or not the law should be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry is obviously entirely consistent with the libertarian position, but it's also entirely consistent with the conservative position. In fact, it was British Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron who famously announced that he supported same-sex marriage not in spite of being a Conservative, but because he was a Conservative. In short, vote yes, there's no good reason not to.
All right, give it up one more time for both of our speakers for keeping it to a perfect 8 minutes each, which means that we have a few minutes for questions. So, yeah, you over here, do you want to?
This question to Gabe. Given that marriage in the civil sense is simply societal recognition of a relationship and thus collective individual recognition, how can you argue from a negative right perspective that it's a right, given that it forces others in a society to recognise, to partake in it, or recognise you?
No one's forced to recognise it. We're talking about the government recognising
But it's whole collective society recognises, and that makes
We're all individuals. I can choose to recognise whatever I like. I don't have to recognise anybody. The government has to, but
What is the government though? Is that not?
it's an organisation headquartered in Canberra.
Question for Rod. You referred to the old definition from common law rather than the Garen of marriage being a union between a man and a woman to the exclusion of others for life. Of course, the Commonwealth Parliament's fiddled with this definition previously, most notoriously in liberalising divorce. Would you, if you endorse the traditional common law definition, would you say that divorce should be prohibited? Would you say that remarriage of divorced people should be prohibited?
No, I was just drawing attention to the fact that there was a definition that a lot of people have said about, no, it's not in the Constitution, so we can do whatever we like with it. But there was, the writers of the Constitution had a definition. Yes, they deliberately in the 70s changed aspects of that definition to change divorce law. But it doesn't take away from the fact that there was a clear definition in the minds of the founding fathers.
So it's okay to fiddle with marriage that suits straight people, but not to fiddle with marriage as a concept if it suits gay people?
No, it's not right to fiddle with marriage or love. What is changing divorce law? What's changing divorce law has helped? Does it help society? Quickly divorces?
But you're opposed to divorce.
I'm opposed to easy divorce, where you undermine. That was one of the first undermining of marriage, was the changes that were brought in the 70s.
Rod, you've talked about the definition of marriage, etc. Do you see today fundamentally under the sort of legal view, the government's legal view of marriage, do you see a distinction between a Christian marriage and an Islamic marriage and a Jewish marriage and an atheist marriage, and like under the current legislation? And is that any significantly different to a gay marriage?
The definition excludes gay marriage. The 2004 definition excludes gay marriage, so it's clear.
Yeah, but the current legislation equates a Christian marriage and an Islamic marriage as the exact same thing.
Well, it gives a definition of marriage. It says you still can't have multiple wives. There's all sorts of regulations around marriage. There's age limits. There's you can't marry certain members of your family. All of those. There's a whole range of rules and.
Yeah, and what I'm asking you is do you see a difference between Islamic marriage and Christian marriage?
As a Christian in a marriage situation, but not under the law. No, under the law, it's clear what a man and a woman.
Right. So the point is that if you see personally a difference between Islamic marriage and a Christian marriage, then surely the legal definition of marriage that the state looks after is unrelated to your personal definition of Christian marriage, and therefore incorporating other such things which you personally wouldn't consider to be a Christian marriage would be perfectly compatible.
Is this a question or a lecture?
What's your point? The definition is there, and it covers everyone. It doesn't matter whether you're Hindu, Christian, whatever. We've set down. We've got a Judeo-Christian foundation for the nation, so that we've got that underlying foundation legislation which speaks to our definition of marriage as it currently is. If you went to the Middle East, then you'd, I imagine you'd be able to have a different definition where you can have up to 4 wives, or you can marry a 9-year-old. Our definition is clear, and it's for everyone to fall within that definition.
Just to answer your question, it's a debate. We'll have one more.
I consider myself pretty much. I don't think you'll find too many people more libertarian at this conference than me. You know, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. But I think, don't you think it's strategic naivety to think that this is simply just a matter of equality and there's no other agenda behind this campaign for yes? I understand that there is no barriers to civil union, so and put that in the context. So what is this exactly then? I think it's more than what you're suggesting.
Oh no, I quite agree that there are people out there with agendas. I'm not denying that. They're not going to go away if we vote no on same-sex marriage. They're going to keep pushing. They're probably going to come back harder if we vote no on same-sex marriage. The point is, it's not about people with agenda. It's about the right of every Australian to be considered equal under Australian law. And at the moment, we don't. We have. It's true that the legislation was changed to make so that there was no difference between heterosexual de facto couples and homosexual de facto couples. Not quite true that there are no differences between married couples and de facto couples. The difference is that heterosexual de facto couples have the choice to get married if they want it. Homosexual couples don't have that choice.
It's just a word. Is that what it is?
No, there are there are several circumstances you can find yourself in where having one of those on your finger makes a hell of a lot of difference. You know, if your partner is sick in the hospital and their family doesn't like you, you know, if you can't walk in and say, I'm her husband, or I'm her wife, or I'm his husband, then, you know, you can be ushered out of the hospital room and say, I'm sorry, sir, you'll have to
That's
leave.
simply not true. That's not
Yeah,
true.
that's true.
Because you can give power of attorney, power of medical guardianship, power of medical
Yes, but when I go
guardianship.
under a
So
bus
it's simply
tomorrow, I
not
don't have
true
any of
to
those
say that it
privileges.
can't be said. It's a lie that the yes vote are promulgating. It's simply not true.
It is true. If I go under a bus without any power of attorney documents in place,
But now you're denying what I've just said. There
denying
are
it.
power of attorneys. There are power of medical
it's
guardianship.
a bit hard to fill
that
one out
one
when you've
person
just
can
been
give
run
to
over by a
another.
bus, though.
So it's simply not true to say that it can't be done.
All right, folks, well, this debate has become quite informal, but let's give it up one more time for our two speakers and then move on to the next session.